Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to make a short video about my general approach towards language learning and my sort of overall philosophy towards it. And I hope I can share maybe a few tips and insights that you haven't heard before in this video. Before I begin, I want to say that if you're not a native English speaker, I recommend that you use this video to help you with your English listening comprehension skills. If you click the CC button, you'll find subtitles at the bottom of the screen. And all you have to do is sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Listen to what I'm saying, read it at the bottom of the screen, and that's a great way to improve your listening comprehension skills. Simply enjoying a video in a foreign language. So with that out of the way, hope you enjoy the video. First of all, I want to highlight that everyone has different goals and different objectives when it comes to language learning. For some people, their goal is to start speaking as soon as they can. Within a few weeks or maybe a month of studying a new language, they want to be out on the streets, talking to people, introducing themselves, making small talk, and get that interaction with native speakers as soon as they can. Go from zero to speaking as fast as possible. And that's a very commendable goal. Personally, my goals are a bit different. I generally do a lot more work by myself at the start. I really work on my comprehension skills, and then only once my comprehension skills are decent do I start working on my speaking and maybe find a tutor or maybe start trying to find opportunities to have a conversation with a native speaker. But as I said, everyone has different goals and it just depends what you want to do. In addition, everyone has different goals for fluency, or in other words, they have different ways or different levels that they want to take their language learning. For me, for some languages, I want to speak them really well. I want to speak them very fluently, like as much as I can. And I have quite ambitious goals for some of them. But for other languages, I only really want to dip my toes in the water and sort of see how they work. I just have more of a personal interest in trying out the language more than anything else. And my goals aren't so lofty. I maybe just want to have a short conversation and introduce myself and nothing more than that. Anyway, I want to give you a rundown of why I think this approach of comprehension first is more effective and how you can use this approach in your own learning. Out of the four main skills in language learning, I personally think that the most important, but also the most difficult to improve, is listening. So your listening comprehension skills. If you want to participate in a conversation with someone, you have to be able to understand what they're saying. You can't just have your speaking skills. You need to understand what the other person is saying. And if you can understand that, you'll probably have a way that you can express yourself. Even if your grammar is not perfect or your vocabulary is not quite there, you will be able to express yourself in some way to make your meaning known. Now, listening can be very difficult to improve, but if you do manage to improve it, it really pays off because it sort of bleeds into all the other skills. For example, listening and reading. If you can listen well, if you have a high level of listening comprehension, you'll probably be able to understand things when you read as well. Because reading is kind of like an easier version of listening. Both are input tasks. You're trying to understand the thing which is given to you. But when you read, you can see the word. You can see where one word ends and another one begins. You can see the endings on the words. You can see how one word is different from another word. Whereas when you listen, sometimes it just sounds like one long word, and it can be hard to divide between each word. You really tell where one of them ends and the next one begins. So in that way, your listening will, in a way, improve your reading skills. But also for speaking. For example, when children learn language, when a baby learns their native language, they listen to their parents and other people around them speak, and they try to imitate what they hear. They just try and make the same sound that they're hearing, even if they don't understand the meaning. They just try to make it. And over time, as they listen more and more and imitate more and more, their listening ability becomes a speaking ability. They go from not being able to speak to being able to speak just by listening and imitating. So in that way, listening is a very rewarding skill to invest in. So, as I said before, if you want to train your listening comprehension, you need to listen to a lot of content. But there is another reason why you need to listen to a lot of content, which is that only a massive exposure to the language will get you the familiarity that you need to speak it at a high level. And I want to give you a short example to explain this. Let's say that I'm learning Korean and I want to speak Korean to the same level that a 15-year-old native speaker speaks Korean. To do this, I need to somehow approach the same level of exposure that they've had to the language. So, in other words, I'm trying to compare myself to somebody who has listened and spoken and read and written Korean every day of their lives for 15 years, maybe 10 or more hours a day of listening alone, let alone the other skills. If I'm going to approach that level of Korean, I need to approach that level of exposure as well. And there might not be a way for me to get that much exposure without, growing up in the same environment. But I need to get close at least. Just listening to a few hours of it won't be nearly enough to reach the level that I'm trying to reach. So you need to be listening to hundreds of hours of content. Every single day you need to be listening to content. And, every day is a minimum. Every day for a few hours is probably more along the lines of what I'm thinking. So a massive, massive amount of content is the only way that you're going to be able to reach a high level of proficiency in a foreign language. One of the main reasons why it's so important to have this massive exposure to the language is so that you can improve your vocabulary, simply increase the number of words you know. And that is one of the biggest hurdles when learning a new language, The fact is that you have to learn a gargantuan amount of words in order to speak it at a high level. You'll see lots of articles and people saying that, the top 1,000 words in a language comprises whatever it is, 70% of all conversations and text. Or that the top 2,000 words comprises 90% of all conversations and text that you'll see. And that is true, With a small vocabulary, you can understand a majority of the words that you see. However, there's a problem. The problem is that the words that don't fall into that top 1,000 or top 2,000 list are the exact words that you'll need to understand the content. If we're talking about the news, or if we're chatting about sports, or if you're watching TV, the words that you need to understand what they're talking about don't fall into that top 1,000 or top 2,000 list. If I take a sentence here and I remove the words that don't fall into the top 1,000 list, you'll see that we have kind of a frame of a sentence, which, looks grammatically interesting, but it doesn't actually tell us anything that we're talking about. We don't really know what the subject is, and we're not going to be able to have any meaningful contribution to it. So I see these first 1,000 words as a kind of a frame for the language, and you should know these words inside and out so that you can understand them intuitively. Whenever you hear them, you know exactly what they mean without having to think at all. They are a frame for the language into which you will insert the other words that you need, the other words relating to other content and subjects that you're interested in. So these, top 1,000 or 2,000 words can give you a sort of a basic conversational ability, but if you want to take it any further, you'll have to expose yourself, again, to a massive amount of content related to all different subjects, different topics, different fields, different things you're interested in, different things you might talk about. You'll need to expose yourself to a massive amount of that kind of content. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about grammar. Now, personally, I quite like studying grammar. I like knowing the rules and knowing how the language works and why things are how they are. But I have to admit that studying grammar is not the most important thing when learning a foreign language, especially not at the beginning. For example, if you look at a baby learning their native language, the baby doesn't study grammar, and they don't even speak with correct grammar. But it doesn't matter. Everyone can understand what they're saying, generally, They might have to sort of piece the words together, but they can understand the meaning and they can get what the baby is trying to say. And even some adults, some native speaker adults, don't speak with correct grammar, and it's not important. Everyone can understand what they're saying, and no one's going to deny that they're a native speaker or anything. So obviously grammar isn't the most important thing to study overall in language. But also, studying grammar at the beginning is not necessarily the most efficient way to learn it at all. Instead, as I've said many times in the video, you should expose yourself to a lot of content, and only then you should learn the grammar. So, for example, if you're seeing a certain grammar point, maybe a case ending or a tense, something like that, You're seeing it lots of times in context, and after seeing it 5 or 6 times, you might think, okay, I've seen that a lot. Why is it like that? Why does it have that ending and not a different one? At that point, you might pick up a textbook or some grammar manual or something, find the relevant point, and then learn the rule behind it. And it'll make a lot more sense than learning it at the start because you've already seen it. You have the context. You've seen it in a sentence with a certain word, with another word following it in the right order. It'll make a lot more sense to learn it at that point rather than learning it at the start. Another thing to look at is not just grammar in the traditional sense, but a thing that I usually refer to as structure. So it can be very useful to learn certain structures in the language, which aren't usually taught in a textbook. So an example in English might be the structure, "It's been a long time since ... This is a fairly common thing to say, and it's very natural sounding, but you won't really find it in any textbook. However, it's a useful thing to learn. If I want to express the idea that I've been doing it for this amount of time, it's good to know that structure that I can put in and insert whatever I need to after it. So it's been a long time since I started learning Korean or something like that. The other consequence of this approach is that if you don't understand a certain grammar point, you can just leave it. It's fine. You can keep listening, keep absorbing the language, keep learning, and maybe after a few more months, after a few more hundreds and hundreds of hours of listening and absorbing the language, you can revisit that grammar point and it might make sense now. There have been countless times in Korean when I haven't understood a grammar point or a certain word or a certain particle at the start, but after just seeing it hundreds and hundreds of times, I got a sort of sense for what it means. I can start to understand the gist of it. No matter how good a grammar explanation is, it will never give you the exact idea or the exact meaning of a certain grammar point. So exposure is the only way to get that. As you might have guessed, one of the main takeaways from this video is the idea that you need to expose yourself to the language a lot. And if you want to find out more about this concept, you can Google the term comprehensible input. This is a concept formulated by the linguist Stephen Krashen, and the result of his work has sort of created a boom of language learning on the internet. And there are lots of content creators who are following these principles of comprehensible input in making their own content and making their own language learning materials. Overall, I think it's been a really good thing for the language learning community, and people have really adopted this concept with open arms. Anyway, that's all for today for this sort of short overview of my approach towards language learning. I'm going to make lots more videos like this one in the near future, about my specific method for learning languages and the actual activities that I do day to day when I'm learning a new language. So I hope this helps you with your own language learning as well. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.